This is fictional story to bring faith and heart.
The door clicked shut with a soft finality, muffling the noise from the hallway. It wasn't loud, but something about that sound made the moment feel sealed off, sacred even. A private space where the world outside couldn't interrupt. Donald Trump sat across from Joe Rogan, leaning slightly back in the chair, his hands resting on the armrests like a man still used to holding weight. The lighting was dim, not dark, but enough to make everything feel a little more real, less polished, less staged. Joe adjusted his headphones and leaned toward the mic, eyes calm but focused. He had done this hundreds of times, sat across from titans, warriors, thinkers, skeptics. But this felt different. Maybe it was the storm outside. Maybe it was the storm inside. "So," Joe began, voice even, "Mr. President, how do you want to be remembered?" Trump smiled, almost smirked, like he'd been waiting for that one. He launched into a monologue that sounded part rally, part resume. Achievements, deals. They said it couldn't be done. A few name drops, and always that phrase, the greatest. Joe nodded, let him speak. It went on for minutes, but something was off. Trump's voice held strength, but his eyes, they weren't quite there. They danced around the room, never fully landing, like someone giving a speech at a funeral but never once looking at the casket. Then, a pause. Joe leaned back slightly, folded his arms. "What about spiritually?" Trump blinked. "What do you mean?" Joe didn't rush. "I mean when all this is gone. The noise, the power, the applause. When you're alone, not politically, not publicly. I mean, really alone. What do you believe happens next?" The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick. Trump exhaled slowly. Not the kind that fills a room. The kind you don't realize you've been holding. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I used to think I did." There was a crack in his tone, subtle, but sharp. And for the first time, Joe didn't see the showman. He saw a man who had built so many towers, maybe just to climb high enough to be seen by someone beyond this world. "My mom," Trump continued, almost surprising himself, "used to read from the Bible. Scottish accent, soft voice. I'd sit on the stairs and listen. I didn't understand much, but it felt like she did." He paused, eyes far away now. She'd say things like, "Donald, God sees even the quiet things." I never knew what that meant. I still don't. Joe leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he does?" Trump didn't answer right away. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. And for a man who lived on words, slogans, speeches, statements, that silence said everything. Somewhere deep in that silence, you could almost hear the hum of a childhood living room. A small boy at the top of a staircase, listening, wanting, wondering if the words were meant for him too. And maybe that's the part he never outgrew. The wondering. Joe didn't press. He just let it hang. Because some questions don't need answers right away, especially not the ones we've been afraid to ask ourselves. Trump cleared his throat, straightened in his seat. But the bravado didn't return. Not fully. He glanced at Joe, something vulnerable flickering behind his eyes. "You know," he said slowly, "people think if you're loud enough, confident enough, you don't have questions." He looked away again. "But the truth is, sometimes the louder you are, the more you're trying not to hear something else." Joe didn't speak. He just nodded, soft, almost reverent. Then, with that same quiet tone, he asked, "When's the last time you felt truly seen? Not by the crowd, not by the cameras, but by God?" Trump's jaw tightened, and for the first time in the conversation, he had nothing to say. Just a single breath, a look downward. and a silence that somehow said more than any answer ever could. The silence lingered like a breath held too long. Trump didn't shift in his chair. He just stared, not at Joe, not at the mic, not even at the floor. Somewhere else entirely. A place neither of them could see, but he had visited many times. A place built from memory, not brick. Joe could have filled the space. He was good at that, redirecting, lightening the mood. But something told him this wasn't the time. So he waited. Trump finally looked up. His voice was lower now, slower, as if each word had to pass through something heavy before reaching his mouth. "There was this night," he said. "I must have been 10, maybe 11. My dad was downstairs yelling at one of my brothers. I don't remember why. Doesn't really matter. I was on the staircase, the same one my mom would sit on when she prayed." He swallowed. She wasn't there that night. Just me. And I remember holding onto the railing like it was going to float me somewhere else. The studio was so still, you could hear the faint hum of the lights above them. "I whispered something," Trump said, barely audible now. "I don't even know why. I just said, 'God, are you there?'" He looked at Joe, suddenly searching. "Isn't that strange? I didn't even go to church that much, but I said it like I expected an answer." Joe finally spoke. "Did you get one?" Trump hesitated. Then, "No." A beat. But I remember how quiet it got. Like everything just paused. Even my dad's voice faded. I thought maybe that meant something. Joe's gaze didn't leave him. "What do you think it meant?" Trump shrugged. But it wasn't the dismissive kind. It was the kind people give when they're afraid the real answer might hurt. "That I wasn't alone," he offered. "Or maybe that I was." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "I've been chasing noise ever since. The crowds, the headlines, the deals, they fill the silence. But sometimes I wonder if I've just been running from that staircase." Joe sat forward. "That's not an easy thing to say." Trump exhaled through his nose. "No, it's not." There was a long pause. Then Joe asked, "When you pray, if you do, what do you say?" Trump looked surprised, not offended, just surprised. "I don't pray much," he admitted. "Not the way people think. I don't kneel. I don't fold my hands. It feels foreign." He looked down at his palms, turned them over. "But sometimes when I'm alone, I'll say something into the air. Not loud, just enough for me to hear it. Things like, 'I hope you're real,' or 'I hope you're still watching.'" Joe leaned back, arms crossed gently. "And do you think he is?" Trump didn't answer right away. Instead, he told another story. "There was this one night in the White House. Everyone was asleep. I walked the halls alone. I stood by the window, looking out over the lawn. It was so quiet. You'd think the world would feel big from there, but it felt small." He paused, voice nearly cracking. "And I felt smaller." Joe's voice was soft. "What did you feel in that moment?" Trump closed his eyes for just a second. "Lonely," he said. Then quieter. "Not politically, not even emotionally, spiritually." That word hung between them. Joe nodded like he'd felt it too. "There's a difference." Trump opened his eyes, something wet glistening at the corners. "There is," he whispered. Then Joe asked, "Do you think that version of you, the boy on the staircase, ever left?" Trump looked down again. And that silence returned. Not empty, not loud, just waiting. Trump's fingers curled slightly, resting on the edge of the table as if gripping the memory itself. The boy on the staircase, fragile, unseen, questioning, seemed to hover somewhere just behind his eyes. Joe didn't speak. He didn't need to. Sometimes, when someone is finally telling the truth, not the media truth, not the PR version, but the kind that aches to be released. Silence is the kindest response. I think about him sometimes, Trump finally said. The boy I was, before the skyscrapers, before the applause, before I learned how to armor myself. Joe's voice came gently. Do you think he'd recognize who you became? Trump didn't answer right away. He pressed his lips together, staring at nothing in particular. I think he'd be impressed, he said. At first, all the gold, the buildings, the name in lights. But then, he paused. His throat moved. I think he'd ask why I stopped listening. Joe tilted his head. Listening to what? Trump hesitated. To that small voice, the one that says, you're more than what people say about you. You're more than what you win or lose. He looked down, voice softer now. I think I buried that voice. Maybe because I didn't know if it was God or just weakness. There was a sadness in that admission, but also something else, a flicker of longing. Joe leaned forward slightly. And if it was God? Trump looked up. Their eyes met. A full second passed. Then I've spent most of my life walking in the opposite direction. He didn't flinch when he said it, didn't sugarcoat it. He just confessed, like a man finally tired of hearing his own echo. Joe's face softened. Do you believe God still speaks? Trump gave a small laugh, but it was hollow. I think he tries. I think the problem is we've filled our world with so much noise that we can't hear him anymore. Then he added, or maybe we don't want to. Joe nodded slowly, then asked, why not? Trump blinked a few times, the way people do when they're fighting off the weight behind their eyes. Because if he's still speaking, he said, then it means I've spent decades ignoring him. Another pause. And that's harder to live with than the silence. For a moment, neither man moved. There were no jokes, no smirks, just two souls across a table, peeling back the layers we all pretend don't exist. Trump rubbed his hands together slowly. My father believed in winning, always. Don't be weak, don't be soft. He never said it, but you could feel it, the pressure, the expectation. He looked up again, voice breaking ever so slightly. But God, if he's anything like what my mother used to pray to, he doesn't love you because you win. He just loves you. Joe sat still. Let the words breathe. Do you believe that? He asked. Trump's face tightened. I want to. Joe didn't push. He just asked the kind of question that comes when ego fades and eternity steps in. What if God never stopped speaking? What if we just stopped listening? Trump let the words sink in, and when he finally responded, his voice wasn't proud or polished or presidential. It was just human. Then I think I've got a lot of listening to catch up on. The words sat there, weighty and naked. But before the moment could close, Trump added something under his breath, barely audible. But I don't know if he'd still want to talk to me. That line didn't come from the president. It came from the boy on the staircase, still wondering if he was ever truly seen. Joe leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed, not on Trump's face, but on something deeper, something past it. He saw it now. The ache, the weight, the quiet kind of sorrow that doesn't come from scandal or failure, but from years of trying to fill a silence that only God could answer. Trump's fingers tapped lightly against the table, once, then twice, like he was thinking through something he couldn't quite say. His voice had fallen into a rhythm that didn't belong to the stage or the camera. It belonged to memory. You know, he said, people think success gives you clarity. Like once you get to the top, everything becomes obvious. But I think it's the opposite. Joe didn't interrupt. Trump's eyes narrowed. not with defiance, but with something closer to regret. The higher I went, the more unsure I became, not about money or strategy. I always knew how to win, but about meaning, purpose. He looked at his hands again, studied them like they belonged to someone else. I had a dream once, years ago. I don't talk about this, not to anyone. Joe leaned in, silently giving permission. I was sitting alone in a room. There were no windows, just this chair, this table, like an interrogation room. And across from me was myself, but younger, maybe 20, 25. Hair perfectly combed, confident, smiling. Trump paused. He looked at me and said, "You got everything you wanted, but did you get what you needed?" He laughed, but it was hollow again. I woke up sweating, couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, and I couldn't answer the question. Still can't. Joe let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "That question doesn't go away, does it?" Trump shook his head. "No, it waits for you. In hotel rooms, in limousines, even in the Oval Office, especially there." His voice dropped. "There's this quiet in certain places, the kind of quiet that makes you wonder if someone's listening, or if you've just been talking to yourself the whole time." Joe took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Do you believe God listens to people who've strayed?" Trump's eyes met his again. "Strayed," he repeated. "That's a kind word for it." Joe didn't flinch. "It's a real word. So is return." Trump didn't answer immediately. He reached for his water, took a sip, and stared at the wall like something invisible was written there. "I don't know how to come back," he said finally. "Not from this far." Joe spoke softly, almost like a father would to a son who'd just confessed to being lost. "You don't come back by force. You come back by surrender." Trump's brow furrowed. "I don't surrender." Joe nodded. "I know. That's why it's the only thing that could change you." Trump looked at him, something flickering behind his expression. "Change me into what?" Joe didn't hesitate. "Into who you were before the noise convinced you you had to earn love." Trump didn't move, didn't blink. Something in that line pierced through decades of defenses. He looked down, then back up. And for a moment, he didn't look like the most powerful man in the room. He looked like the loneliest. Then, almost whispering, he asked, "Do you think it's too late?" Joe's reply was quiet but steady. "No. But I think the longer you wait, the quieter his voice gets. Not because he's gone, but because he refuses to compete with your noise." Trump swallowed hard. He didn't argue. He just sat there, breathing through the heaviness. And then he said something so quietly, Joe almost missed it. "I don't know how to be loved without performing." That was it. The fracture beneath the empire, the wound beneath the gold. Joe didn't speak. He didn't need to. That sentence, "I don't know how to be loved without performing," wasn't just an admission. It was the key Trump had never let anyone see, much less hand over. And once it was out, it filled the room like incense. Slow, lingering, holy in a way that couldn't be explained. Trump leaned back, his eyes glassy but steady. He wasn't trying to escape the moment. He was trying to survive it. "I used to believe," he said slowly, "that love was something you earned. Win enough, be strong enough, say the right thing, own the room, and you'd be worthy." He laughed softly, but there was pain behind it. "Turns out, all it ever made me was loud." Joe tilted his head. "Loud, but still unheard?" Trump nodded. "Yeah." Then he looked straight at Joe. "You ever feel that?" Joe thought for a moment. "All the time." That answer seemed to land heavier than expected. Trump studied him. "You don't look like someone who would." Joe shrugged. "That's the thing about silence. It doesn't show up in pictures. Trump looked down at the table. His fingers traced the edge, slowly. I thought building towers would make the silence smaller. I thought gold would drown it out. But all it did was echo it louder. Joe sat forward. You can be surrounded by people and still feel like no one's home inside you. Trump nodded. Exactly. He paused, then asked, do you think God really sees us? Like, not just what we show, but all of it? Joe took a deep breath. I think that's the only version he ever sees. Trump blinked slowly. That truth unsettled him. Not because it sounded wrong, but because it might be right. I've spent years curating a version of myself, he said. Polished, tough, always in control. He looked up, eyes shining now. But if God sees past all that, then he sees a man who's afraid to be forgotten when the noise stops. Joe sat in that moment with him, not trying to fix it. Then he said quietly, that's the part he loves the most. Trump let out a shaky breath. I don't understand that kind of love. Joe nodded. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to receive it. Trump frowned. And if I don't deserve it? Joe didn't flinch. No one does. That line hit hard. Trump leaned forward, elbows on the table now, hands clasped. For a man who had spent his life gripping control, this posture looked strangely childlike. I remember once, he said, in Sunday school, we had this teacher, Mrs. Keller. She was kind, not loud, not impressive, but she told this story about Jesus washing people's feet. He shook his head slowly, voice cracking. I didn't get it. Why would someone with power stoop that low? Joe didn't speak. Trump looked up, eyes red now. But now, I think that's the only kind of power that matters. Joe leaned in, voice barely audible, because love without power is fragile, but power without love, that's just fear in a louder suit. Trump wiped at his eye, subtle but unmistakable. Then, as if surprised by his own voice, he asked, do you think God could love someone who's spent so much of his life trying to replace him? And suddenly the question wasn't just his. It belonged to every person who ever tried to earn their way into being seen, and feared that love would only come if they performed perfectly. Joe answered slowly, he never asked you to compete with him, just to come home. And Trump, who had built empires, sat in the highest office, commanded crowds, just whispered, I don't know the way back. Joe's eyes didn't leave his. You don't have to. You just have to stop running. Trump looked away, his voice barely audible now. But what if I forgot how to stop? The room fell still. Not with tension, but with that sacred kind of quiet that only comes after someone tells the truth they didn't know they were holding. The kind of truth that humbles even the strongest, not because it breaks them, but because it begins to free them. Trump's voice still echoed faintly in Joe's ears. But what if I forgot how to stop? He didn't look at Joe when he said it. He looked past him, through him maybe, towards something neither of them could fully see. Like a man staring down the length of a hallway he used to know, but couldn't walk anymore. Joe sat forward, elbows resting on his knees now. Less like a host, more like a friend on the front steps. You ever watch a bird fly into a window? Joe asked gently. Trump looked up, caught off guard. What? Joe smiled slightly. It's not trying to be stupid. It sees the light. It thinks it's the way out. But it keeps hitting the glass, again and again, until it either hurts itself or finally rests long enough to realize the truth. Trump didn't speak. He just listened. Joe continued. Sometimes we think movement means progress, but there's a kind of movement that just comes from fear, from panic, from trying to outrun silence. He paused, then added, "You haven't forgotten how to stop. You've just never been taught that stopping isn't failure." Trump breathed deeply. That line settled somewhere deep in him, far beyond politics or platforms. "I was raised to believe that if you stop, you lose," he said. "That rest is weakness. That doubt is dangerous." Joe nodded. "And where did that belief get you?" Trump's eyes lowered again. He didn't have to say it. There was a long pause. Then he whispered, "It got me applause." Another pause. "And emptiness." Joe let the words rest before offering his own. "What if emptiness isn't a punishment, but an invitation?" Trump raised his eyes. "To what?" he asked. Joe's voice was quiet now, firm but not forceful. "To return." Trump sat with that. The word felt old, sacred, familiar, like something once read to him on a stairwell long ago. Return to what? To the version of you that knew he couldn't earn love, but maybe believed it still found him anyway. Trump exhaled. That version's buried. Joe looked straight at him. "Then maybe this silence you're in now is God digging." Trump chuckled softly, but the emotion behind it betrayed him. "I don't know what he'll find if he does." Joe didn't blink. "He already knows. He's just waiting for you to want him to find it too." That landed deep. Trump stared at the table again. A man who had lived most of his life convincing the world he didn't need anything from anyone, now sitting in a podcast studio, questioning whether the only thing he ever truly needed was still possible. Then he asked, quieter than before, "But what does returning even look like?" Joe didn't rush the answer. "It looks like surrender, like choosing to be loved even when you don't feel lovable, like letting God speak louder than the applause or the shame." Trump looked up, and then, with the softest tone he'd used the entire night, he asked, "What if I've forgotten how to be still?" Joe leaned forward. No script, no plan, just truth. "Then be still now." And for a full minute they said nothing. No sound, no movement, just two men sitting in silence, one of them for the first time in years. The stillness stretched on. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't staged. It was the kind of silence that pressed its hand on your shoulder and told you to sit with yourself, to stop outrunning the parts of you that still ached, still longed, still waited for a voice that wasn't your own. Trump sat with his hands folded now, resting on the edge of the table. His breathing had slowed, not calm, but deliberate, like someone trying to remember how it felt to breathe without performance. Joe didn't move either. He knew better than to fill the moment. Some moments weren't meant to be saved. They were meant to be surrendered to. After a long while, Trump finally spoke. "I've had thousands cheer for me," he said, voice low. "But I don't remember what it feels like to be wanted when I have nothing to give." His voice trembled just slightly. Just enough. Joe leaned in. "Have you ever let someone love you when you had no strength left to impress them?" Trump shook his head slowly. "I don't think I've ever even let myself see who I am without the winning." He looked up, his eyes searching the space between them. "Because if I'm not the winner, who am I?" Joe breathed in. That question, "Who am I without the noise?" wasn't just his. It belonged to every soul that ever learned to confuse applause with affection, spotlight with belonging, strength with safety. "You're still you," Joe said softly. "Just unguarded, and God's not afraid of that version." Trump looked down again, as if staring into a part of himself he'd boarded up long ago. "You think he sees me now?" he asked. Joe nodded. "I think he always has." Trump paused. Then, like a child uncertain of how to ask, "And he doesn't hate me for the years I ignored him?" That question didn't come from ego. It came from exhaustion. Joe leaned forward again, elbows on the table, hands clasped together. He doesn't hate you, Donald. He hurts with you. Trump blinked hard. Hurts with me? Joe nodded. He's not waiting to punish you. He's waiting to hold the parts of you that never stopped aching. Trump looked down at his hands. They never told me that version of God, he said. Joe's voice stayed soft. That's because the version you were given came with rules and rewards. But the real God, he comes with rest. Trump looked up sharply. And what does rest even look like for someone like me? Joe gave a sad smile. Not being in control, not needing to be impressive, not having to talk your way into being loved. He let that linger before saying, "It looks like admitting that the towers you built don't touch the sky." Trump let out a slow breath. And what if they were never supposed to? Joe met his eyes. Then maybe the point was never to climb to God, but to sit still long enough to let him come to you. There was a long, loaded pause. Trump stared at the table, then said, "But what if when he shows up? I don't know how to receive him." Joe didn't look away. "Then let him teach you, like a father would." And then, with his voice almost cracking, Trump asked, "Even now? After everything?" Joe nodded, eyes gentle. "Especially now, because only the broken ask to be made whole." Trump looked away, lips tight, throat tense. And in that moment, he didn't look presidential. He looked like a man whose soul had finally whispered, "Help." Trump's throat moved, hard. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was tender, like the hush that comes after someone admits they're tired and someone else finally says, "You don't have to carry this alone." He leaned back in his chair, but it didn't look like retreat. It looked like surrender. Not to Joe, not to the moment, but to the truth he could no longer outrun. "You know what's strange?" he said, eyes still low. "When I walk into a room, everyone reacts. They adjust, they perform, even the ones who say they won't." Joe nodded slowly. Trump looked up, his expression softer now. "But not you." Joe didn't smile. He just met the moment with presence. "Because I'm not afraid of you," he said. Trump blinked. "And maybe," Joe continued, "part of you's been waiting to see if anyone would say that." Trump looked down, hands open on the table now, like someone ready to receive instead of resist. "I think I've been afraid of that boy on the staircase," he said. "The one who cried out for God and heard nothing." Joe's voice stayed gentle. Maybe he didn't hear nothing. Maybe he just heard silence. Trump frowned. "What's the difference?" Joe's answer was quiet but firm. "Silence isn't absence. It's invitation." Trump looked over, unsure. "Invitation to what?" "To trust," Joe said. "To believe that even when you feel unseen, you're still held." There was a pause. Then Trump whispered, "Held by who?" And Joe gave the only answer that mattered. "By the one who formed you. Not your image, not your reputation. Just you." Trump stared at the floor. "I don't think I've ever let anyone hold me without expecting me to earn it." Joe nodded. "That's why this feels so foreign." Trump's eyes shimmered just slightly. "You know what I'm scared of?" he said. Joe waited. "That if I stop performing, I'll disappear." He looked up, something trembling behind the decades of defense. "That if I let go of all the identity I've built, there won't be anything left." Joe didn't flinch. "I know that fear." Trump met his gaze. "But I also know," Joe said, "that what's left when the applause fades is the only part of you God's been talking to this whole time." Trump inhaled, long and quiet. Then he asked, as if the question had lived inside him for years, "Why would God love a man who's only ever known how to take. Joe's eyes softened. Because God isn't in love with your behavior. He's in love with your being. Trump looked at his hands again. I don't know how to be just being. Joe's voice was almost a whisper. Then start here, with nothing to prove, with no audience. Trump looked around the dim studio, the walls quiet, the cameras forgotten, and something shifted in his face. Not a breakdown, not a dramatic turn, just the quiet, almost invisible loosening of a man's grip on the mask he forgot he was wearing. He rubbed his chest gently, almost unconsciously. You know, he said, sometimes at night, I feel this tightness, right here, like there's something pressing in. Joe nodded. That's your soul trying to speak. Trump blinked hard, his voice small now. What if I don't know how to listen? Joe didn't move. He just said, then don't try to hear with your ears. Let your ache be the way you pray. Trump held his breath, and in the softest voice he'd used all night, he asked, is it really that simple? Joe paused, then said, no, but it's that sacred. And in that fragile silence, the strongest man in the room finally let himself feel small, without shame. The hum of the studio faded into the background. Trump didn't notice it. Not anymore. All the noise that once surrounded him, the expectations, the cameras, the ego, had gone quiet. Not because they'd left, but because for the first time in his life, he'd stopped listening to them. He stared at his reflection in the table's surface, not the sharp, composed version he was used to seeing on television screens. This was a man undone, gentler, older, quieter. Joe watched him, not with curiosity, but with compassion. Then Trump spoke. Do you think a person can forget how to feel loved? Joe nodded slowly. I think we don't forget. We just stop trusting it. Trump raised his eyes. And why would we do that? Joe's answer came like a sigh. Because love makes us vulnerable. And somewhere along the line, we convinced ourselves that vulnerability is weakness. Trump swallowed hard. My father, he never said, I love you. Not once. He paused. He gave us rules, discipline, approval if we succeeded, but not love. Joe didn't rush him. Trump continued, quieter now. My mother was different. She prayed, she read scripture out loud, she touched my face when I was sick. But even with her, I didn't know how to receive it. It made me uncomfortable. He stared at his hands again. I didn't want tenderness. I wanted applause. Applause felt safer. Joe's voice came gently. But applause fades. Love remains. Trump exhaled deeply, like the words struck something inside. I thought if I became big enough, loud enough, powerful enough, I'd finally outrun that ache. Joe leaned in. And did you? Trump met his gaze. No. A pause. I just buried it beneath gold and noise. But it's still there. I feel it in hotel rooms, after rallies, on flights home. That ache, like something's missing, but I don't even know what. Joe nodded. That ache is sacred. Trump blinked. Sacred? Joe's eyes didn't waver. It's not something to medicate or silence. It's a signal that you were made for something more than applause, that beneath everything the world told you to be, you still remember the voice that first called you loved. Trump looked down, and this time he didn't speak right away. Then he said, almost trembling, but what if I've damaged that voice beyond repair? Joe shook his head. You can't damage the voice of God, but you can drown it. He paused, and even then, it never leaves. It just waits. Trump sat still, the room holding him like he was made of glass. I'm afraid, he said. Joe tilted his head. Of what? Trump's voice broke, just slightly. That if I stop pretending, I won't recognize who I really am. Joe leaned closer. That's where faith begins. Trump let that settle. Faith in what? Joe's voice was soft but unwavering. That the version of you who doesn't perform is still worthy of love. That God doesn't need your strength. He just wants your surrender. Trump looked at him, eyes red now. And what if I can't surrender? Joe smiled, not in mockery, but in understanding. Then start with honesty. Start with what you just said. That's surrender already. Trump nodded slowly, emotion rising like a tide. I don't know how to be this open. Joe's reply came with weight. Then let this be the first moment in your life where you don't have to know. You just have to be. Trump closed his eyes. And in the sacred quiet of that moment, a man who'd spent his entire life being seen finally allowed himself to be known, not for his victories, but for his ache. Trump sat with his eyes closed, breathing in something unfamiliar. Peace that didn't come from control. For a man who had defined himself by dominance, the stillness felt almost unearthly. Joe didn't move. He just watched, with the quiet reverence of someone witnessing something sacred and fragile unfold. When Trump finally opened his eyes, they looked different. Not defeated, not broken, just real. I don't think I've ever done this, he said. Joe's brow furrowed gently. Done what? Trump swallowed, then said it slowly. Stop performing. Let someone see me before I put on the armor. His voice cracked as he added, even I forgot who was underneath it. Joe nodded, resting his arms gently on the table. The world teaches us that we're only as valuable as what we can offer, what we can prove, what we can build. He met Trump's eyes. But God sees value in what's simply true. Trump blinked. And what if what's true isn't impressive? Joe didn't hesitate. Then it's even more beautiful. The words settled like water in dry soil. Trump leaned back, exhaling. You know, I used to think being loved meant being needed, that if I wasn't useful, loud, strong, untouchable, people would forget me. Joe's voice softened. But God doesn't love usefulness. He loves presence. Trump stared down at his hands. I've spent decades being present on every stage, except the one where it mattered. Joe tilted his head. Which stage is that? Trump whispered. My own soul. There was no need to fill the silence that followed. It was the kind of pause that asked to be felt, not fixed. Joe finally said, What would happen if you let that boy on the staircase speak again? Trump's face tightened. I don't know if I'd recognize his voice. Maybe not, Joe said, but he'd recognize yours. Trump glanced over. You think he's still in there? Joe didn't blink. I think he's been waiting for you to come home. Trump looked away, emotion building again, raw and unscripted. I always imagined that version of me was soft, weak. Joe shook his head. No, that version of you had the most faith, because he still believed someone was listening. Trump closed his eyes again, and then quietly, I want to believe again. Joe nodded. Then start there. But I don't know how to believe without answers. Joe leaned forward. Then believe with your questions. Trump frowned slightly. What do you mean? I mean faith isn't having everything figured out. It's trusting that something greater is holding you even when everything falls apart. Trump was quiet. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly, then said, So what now? Joe smiled gently. You keep walking, but this time not to prove anything, not to outrun silence. You walk to listen. Trump nodded, just once. Then, hesitating, Do you really think God hasn't given up on me? Joe reached across the table, not with force, not with drama, just a hand resting beside Trump's open. And he said, He didn't give up on you when you ignored him. He didn't give up when you tried to replace him. And he won't give up now that you're finally facing him. Trump looked down at that hand, then slowly placed his own beside it, not as a handshake, not as a gesture of agreement, but as a step toward being known. No applause, no performance, just a man returning to the part of himself he thought was lost. Their hands rested quietly on the table, not clasped, not gripping, just touching. Trump didn't look at Joe. He looked down, but it was the first time he'd let someone be that close without needing to take back control. The moment wasn't about power. It was about presence. And presence, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel threatening. Trump spoke softly. When I was younger, I thought prayer was something you performed, something you did right, like a speech. Joe nodded. A lot of us learned it that way. Trump took a breath, slow and unsure. But lately, I've started thinking maybe prayer is more like breathing. You don't do it to be seen. You do it because if you don't, you suffocate. Joe smiled gently. Exactly. Trump looked up at him. Do you pray? Joe nodded. Every day. Trump studied him. What do you say? Joe shrugged, not flippantly, but honestly. Sometimes I don't say anything. I just sit. I close my eyes. I breathe. I try to remember that I'm already loved, even if I don't feel it that day. Trump's lips pressed together. He looked like someone who wanted to believe that could be enough, that prayer didn't need to be loud to be real. I've prayed more in my head than I ever have out loud, he admitted, but the words never felt holy. They felt scared, desperate, not sacred. Joe's voice was tender. Maybe desperation is sacred. Trump blinked. How? Joe leaned in. Because when you're desperate, you stop pretending. You don't perform when you're drowning. You cry out. He paused, then added, and God hears that cry more clearly than any polished prayer. Trump looked away again, his face caught between disbelief and hope. I thought maybe God stopped listening to me a long time ago. Joe shook his head. No. Maybe you just stopped believing he wanted to. There was something honest in that. Trump nodded slowly. I've done things, he said. Said things, used people, hurt people. I built an image I couldn't keep up with. And when I realized it, I doubled down. I became louder, stronger, meaner, because if I stopped... He trailed off. Joe finished the thought for him. You'd be exposed. Trump nodded. And I didn't know if anyone could love what they'd see underneath. Joe's voice was soft. But that's the only version God's been waiting for. Trump didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes were glassy again, not from sadness, but something deeper. A longing that had been waiting its entire life to breathe. Then Joe asked, Can I pray with you? Trump looked surprised, not offended, just uncertain. You mean now? Joe smiled. Yeah, not for show, not for religion, just to remind you you're not alone. Trump hesitated. He looked down at his hands again. Then, with a nod barely visible, he whispered, Okay. Joe closed his eyes. Trump didn't, but he didn't look away either. And Joe began, not with big words or holy phrases, just breath. Then softly, God, thank you for being here, even when we forget, even when we run. Thank you that your love doesn't flinch when we finally stop pretending. Thank you for Donald's courage, for this moment, for silence that speaks, and for grace that waits. Trump closed his eyes, not tightly, not fearfully, just quietly. And for the first time, the man who had spent decades filling rooms with noise let stillness speak for him. Trump's eyes stayed closed even after the prayer ended. It wasn't from reverence, not in the traditional sense. It was because something was happening inside him, something he didn't want to interrupt. He wasn't thinking about cameras, or critics, or legacy. For once, he wasn't thinking about anything at all. He was just being. And that, for a man who had spent most of his life trying to be more, felt strangely holy. Joe sat beside him in the quiet, not saying a word, just waiting. Like someone who knew what not to say mattered just as much as what to say. Finally, Trump opened his eyes. They were red, but not from anger, not from exhaustion. They were red from being honest. "I don't know what that was," he said, voice low. Joe looked over. "It doesn't need a name." Trump nodded, then he laughed, just a little, not from humor, but relief. "I don't think I've ever done that before." Joe smiled. "You didn't perform. You just showed up." Trump leaned back in the chair, hands on his lap. "I always thought prayer was about answers." He looked over, eyes softer now. "But maybe it's about presence," Joe nodded. "It is." There was a pause. Trump stared up toward the ceiling, as if trying to remember something long forgotten. "When I was a boy," he said, "I used to lie in bed and ask God not to forget me." He paused. "Not to forget that I was still here, under all the noise." Joe's face didn't change, because he understood. Trump continued, "And somewhere along the way, I stopped asking." "Why?" Joe asked. Trump's voice cracked. "Because I figured maybe he already had." Silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. It was filled with something unseen, something deeper than emotion, deeper than words. Then Joe asked, "Do you want to ask again?" Trump didn't answer at first. He just looked at him, and in a voice so gentle it barely reached the microphone, he said, "Yeah, I do." So they sat again. But this time it wasn't Joe praying over him. It was Trump, whispering not a performance, but a plea, not a speech, but a sentence. "God, I don't know if you still hear me, but if you do, I'm tired of running. I don't know how to come back. But if you want me, I'm listening." His eyes stayed closed. A tear fell. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Joe didn't move. Because that moment was sacred. Not because it was perfect, but because it was true. Trump opened his eyes slowly, and he didn't look embarrassed. He looked free. Not fully, not finally, but a little more than he'd ever been before. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I don't know what's next," he said. Joe nodded. "You're not supposed to." Trump looked over. "That's hard for me." "I know," Joe replied. "But faith doesn't mean you know the next step. It just means you trust the one walking beside you." Trump leaned forward, his voice stronger now, but not hard, just whole. "I want to learn how to walk with him." Joe smiled. "Then take the next breath. That's where it starts." And so he did. One breath, one moment, one man, still powerful, still flawed, still uncertain, but finally willing to stop pretending he didn't need God. Trump sat still, his breathing slow and even. He didn't speak for a long time, and Joe didn't push. Some conversations end in silence, not because there's nothing left to say, but because something deeper has been said without words. Eventually, Trump ran a hand through his hair, his voice rough from emotion. "You know," he began, "I always thought legacy was about what you leave behind. Buildings, books, headlines, statues, power." He paused. "But now I'm starting to think, maybe legacy is what you leave in people, not for them." Joe tilted his head, interested. "What do you want to leave in people?" Trump stared off again. "That I was more than the name. That underneath the armor, there was a real human being trying to figure out how to be loved." Joe nodded. "That's a legacy worth leaving." Trump smiled sadly. "Doesn't feel very presidential." Joe raised an eyebrow. "Maybe it's the most presidential thing you've ever said." Trump let out a breath that sounded like a laugh and a sigh combined. The kind of sound that only comes after confession. The kind that leaves you lighter. I spent years trying to fill a hole I couldn't name, he said. With applause, with gold, with control. He looked Joe in the eye now, but nothing filled it, because it wasn't a hole that success could reach. Joe didn't speak, letting the weight of the words settle. Trump continued. That night on the staircase when I was a kid, I really believed someone was listening, not out of religion, not out of fear, just faith. And somehow, over the years, I buried that boy so deep I forgot he ever existed. Joe leaned in, but he never stopped waiting. Trump nodded slowly. Yeah, and I think maybe tonight I found him again. He looked down at his hands, older now, worn with time and battle. He's quieter now, wiser maybe, but he still wants the same thing. Joe smiled. To be seen, to be known, to be loved. Trump whispered, and to know it was never about being worthy first. The room fell silent again, but it was warm now, not heavy, like the final rays of sun before nightfall. Trump turned toward Joe, his voice thoughtful. Do you think, if I really change, really walk this road back, people will still respect me? Joe looked at him with kindness. Some might respect you less, but others, they'll see you for the first time, and they'll finally trust you, not because of your strength, but because of your honesty. Trump's lips pressed together. That's terrifying. Joe nodded. It's supposed to be. Trump chuckled softly, shaking his head. I never thought a podcast would turn into a confessional. Joe smiled. It didn't. You just finally let someone see the part of you that never had a mic. Trump let that sit. Then slowly, he stood up. Not abruptly. Not with drama. He stood like a man who wasn't leaving the conversation, but stepping into something new. Joe stood too. Trump extended his hand. Not for a photo, not for politics, just a gesture of something real. Joe shook it, and in that moment, there was nothing left to prove. Just two men who had spoken the kind of truth that lingers. As they headed toward the door, Trump turned back. He looked at the studio, the chair, the table, and then quietly he said, Maybe God never left. Maybe I just stopped looking for him in the silence. Joe smiled. You didn't find him tonight, Donald. You just stopped running long enough for him to catch you. The door to the studio creaked open. Cool air drifted in, carrying with it the quiet of the outside world. Cars passing, leaves brushing the sidewalk, life moving on. Trump stood in the doorway for a moment, not stepping out, not quite ready to leave. His hand rested on the frame like someone unsure if they were walking away from something or into something else entirely. Joe stood behind him, silent, watching. Trump turned, eyes a little clearer now, voice calm. You think this, whatever this was tonight, changes anything? Joe smiled. Only if you let it. Trump nodded slowly. Feels like something's cracking inside me. Maybe, Joe said gently. It's not cracking. Maybe it's opening. Trump considered that. Opening to what? Joe shrugged. To the part of you that's been waiting all these years. The part that doesn't need applause. The part that only needs grace. Trump looked down, then said, almost to himself, Grace. That's a word I never knew how to hold. Joe nodded. That's because grace doesn't come with conditions. It just waits for you to say yes. Trump stepped outside now, but slowly, like someone careful not to break the moment. The streetlights flickered softly above him. The noise of the city moved around them, but in a distant sort of way. It felt quieter, or maybe he'd just become more aware of what wasn't noise. He turned to Joe one last time. There's something about that question you asked, the one that started this. Joe waited. Trump repeated it to himself. When's the last time you felt truly alone? Not politically, but spiritually. He exhaled sharply. That question didn't hurt because I didn't know the answer. It hurt because I knew it too well. Joe nodded. And now? Trump paused, looked down at his feet, then up at the stars just beginning to push through the dark sky. I don't feel alone right now. Joe smiled. Trump continued, still confused, still afraid of what comes next, but not alone. He looked Joe in the eye. And maybe that's the beginning. Joe stepped forward, laid a hand on his shoulder. It always is. Trump's face twitched, just enough to show that emotion still lived close to the surface. And then, in the softest voice of the night, he said, "Do you think he really heard me?" Joe didn't answer right away. He let the silence breathe between them. Then he said, "He heard you before you even spoke. He's just been waiting for you to believe it." Trump nodded slowly. No dramatic exit, no big farewell. Just a man walking towards something he couldn't yet define. And as he disappeared into the dark, there was no applause. Just quiet. A sacred kind of quiet. The kind that follows real change. The kind that doesn't need to be seen to be true. And back in the studio, Joe sat alone once more. He reached over, gently turned off the microphone. The red light went dark. But in that darkness, a question still remained. For Donald. For Joe. And maybe for everyone listening. What if the only thing standing between you and God is the noise you won't let go of? And in that question, the story didn't end. It just began.